9:47 a.m., the 11th of January 1944. The low clouds over northwestern Germany hung like a dense grey shroud. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter couldn't see beyond the tips of his wings. He didn't need to. The Jägerleitung, fighter control, whispered coordinates into his ear through the ever-present static. Angel of the North, Vector 270, massive contact, altitude 180. Massive. The word was a stigma, an echo repeating almost daily. Massive contact. It was the language of inevitability. Richter made a subtle adjustment to the trim of his FW190A6, feeling the familiar, reassuring vibration of the BMW 801D2 engine. A dry, powerful purr, but only one. Below, the Reich breathed shallowly, hidden beneath the cloud's suffocating pall. Above, somewhere beyond 5,500 meters, 180 in Luftwaffe parlance, the enemy climbed relentlessly. His squadron, 3./JG-26, was already airborne, probing for weaknesses in the thick, cotton-white sky of winter. 6 machines against what they knew would be an overwhelming tide. The FW190 was a thoroughbred, heavy and robust, armed with truly brutal firepower. 220 MMMG, 151 20th cannons in the wing roots and two 7.92 MMMG, 17 machine guns above the engine, capable of tearing apart bombers if one could only get close enough. The air in the cockpit was cold and stale, tinged with the metallic tang of the oxygen from his mask. Klaus meticulously scanned the dials. Oil temperature, fuel pressure, engine RPM. All within optimal ranges. His training, years of disciplined, methodical dedication, told him he was in complete command of his machine. Yet, the air war of 1944 was no longer simply a matter of individual skill or the inherent quality of the aircraft. It was an unforgiving equation of sheer numbers, dwindling fuel, and precious, fleeting seconds. Angel of the North, ascend to 200, primary contact, 100 miles, heading 350. The Jägerleitung's voice conveyed no discernible emotion. It didn't need to. The pilots felt it, acutely, a straight line, 100 miles long, pointing directly at the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. Again. This was not a raid. It was a scheduled, brutal incision. Richter banked the FW190, the engine screaming at full combat power. The 6 German fighters punched through the cloud layer, bursting into a clear, frigid blue. Above them, the sun blazed with a blinding clarity, illuminating a vast, unsettling desert of water vapor stretching to the distant horizon. And then he saw them. It was not merely a group. It was not just a squadron. It was a formation so profoundly dense, so chillingly disciplined, it resembled molten silver flowing majestically across the very roof of the world. Hundreds of gleaming points, glinting like shattered mirror shards, meticulously stacked in box formations, ascending inexorably towards the heavens. B-17, flying fortresses. Klaus's jaw tightened. His thumb instinctively grazed the cannon button on the control stick. 36 bombers packed into a single formidable defensive box. 20 such boxes comprising a combat wing. 6 entire combat wings forming one terrifying, gargantuan wave. More than 700 heavy bombers, each one bristling with defensive guns, spitting lethal fire. And guarding them, the formidable escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. Hundreds of them. The Jägerleitung had not overstated it. This was massive. And there was no tangible wall, no physical barrier to halt their relentless advance. Only 6 machines, 6 desperate specks, trying to become that impossible wall. The distance between hunter and hunted, between vulnerable and the overwhelming, closed with every passing second. There was no doubt about the grim ballet that was about to unfold. The sky, once a sanctuary, had been brutally torn open. The distant glint of the American bombers intensified, resolving from abstract points into distinct, menacing silhouettes. Klaus Richter pushed his FW190 closer to his wingman, Feldwebel Werner Brandt, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible task ahead. Their engines roared, a fragile symphony against the vast, indifferent silence of the stratosphere. The sun, now high and sharp, turned the aluminium skins of the B-17S into blinding beacons, reflecting an almost arrogant confidence. Angel of the North, hostile fighters, you're 11 o'clock high, bearing 160. The Jägerleitung's voice, though calm, now carried the sharper edge of immediate peril. The American escort fighters, the Little Friends as the bomber crews called them, were already positioned for the kill. These were not the early, tentative encounters of the war. These were seasoned predators, flown by pilots who had made the long journey across the North Sea and back countless times. They understood the grim mathematics of the mission. Richter scanned the sky. There, above and to the left, a swarm of P-47 Thunderbolts, their distinctive blunt noses and massive radial engines unmistakable. They looked like silver-bellied sharks, circling, waiting for the moment to dive. Each Thunderbolt carried 8.50 caliber machine guns capable of spewing 1,200 rounds per minute. Against the FW-190 with its shorter range cannons, it was a brutal dance of engagement. Break right, bogies at 2 o'clock. Brandt's voice, strained but clear, crackled in Richter's ear. Without hesitation, Klaus snapped his FW-190 into a hard right turn, feeling the G-forces press him deep into his seat. Tracers, bright red lines of death, streaked past where he had been moments before. A Thunderbolt, its engine roaring, flashed across his canopy. He brought his machine around, a blur of grey camouflage and black crosses against the pale blue. His finger found the cannon button, a primal instinct. He saw a P-47, briefly silhouetted against a distant cumulus, a short, controlled burst. The FW-190 shuddered as the 20mm shells ripped from its wings. Miss. The Thunderbolt rolled, effortlessly evading. Its pilot knew the game. The German tactics were simple, desperate. Punch through the fighter screen. Get to the bombers. Every B-17 carried at least 10.50 caliber machine guns, forming interlocking fields of fire, a flying hedgehog. To get close was to run a gauntlet of lead. To stay back was to watch Germany burn. Klaus saw another Thunderbolt, this one a P-51 Mustang, sleek and deadly, with its distinctive laminar flow wing. Faster, more agile than the Thunderbolt, a true long-range killer. The P-51S were the new terror, capable of escorting the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. They had closed the gap, denying the Luftwaffe its crucial home advantage. The war, once fought over the Channel, was now a daily massacre above their own cities. His own squadron was already scattered. Brandt was locked in a spiraling dogfight with 2 Thunderbolts, a desperate ballet of turns and climbs. The other 4 FW-190S were specks, swallowed by the sheer volume of the American air armada. The contact massivo was no longer a statistic. It was a swirling, chaotic vortex of metal, fire, and human will. Richter felt a tremor run through his aircraft, not from an enemy hit, but from the concussion of distant explosions. Flares, white-hot and fleeting, blossomed in the bomber-stream tracer fire from the B-17S, tearing into the brave but futile frontal attacks of other German squadrons, probably from JG-1 or JG-11. They were throwing everything they had at this monstrous formation, and it was barely making a dent. He broke left, momentarily clearing his tail. Below, through a thin patch in the clouds, he caught a glimpse of the patchwork German countryside. Fields, small villages, the winding ribbon of a river. They were fighting for that, for the land, for the homes, for the very air they breathed. But the sky above was no longer theirs. It was a vast, unforgiving theatre of overwhelming force, dominated by the relentless silver swarm. He knew, with a cold certainty, that this was merely the prelude. The real terror, the rain of destruction, was yet to fall. The roar of Klaus Richter's FW-190 was a constant, deafening companion, punctuated by the ragged bursts of machine gun fire from unseen battles. He was alone now, the radio a cacophony of distorted shouts and static. Brandt, his wingman, had vanished in the blur of a desperate roll, swallowed by the sheer mass of American fighters. Survival was a solitary endeavor. Richter pushed his FW-190 through a tight loop, momentarily losing sight of the B-17S, only to reacquire them a colossal, unyielding formation, their tails now closer, more defined. He could see the dark muzzle flashes of their .50 caliber guns, a constant furious sparkling in the high blue. They were within range, yet still an insurmountable fortress. The German directive was clear, if suicidal: break the bomber formations. Dispersing even a few B-17S could create gaps, opportunities for more effective attacks, but to do so required an act of reckless courage, a direct charge into the heart of the storm. He knew the strategy: the single-pass attack, preferably from above or head-on, delivering a concentrated burst and then escaping before the overwhelming defensive fire could lock onto him. He lined up on a trailing element of B-17S, their 4 engines churning out contrails that stretched like white banners across the sky. He could feel the vibration of his own engines, a desperate thrumming, urging him forward. His airspeed indicator crept up, 550 kilometers per hour, then 600. He needed every ounce of speed, every advantage of surprise. Suddenly, his warning light flared. A red flicker on the instrument panel, fuel pressure dropping. A glance at the gauge confirmed it. Not critical, but concerning. A stray bullet? A stress fracture from the violent maneuvers? The FW-190 was a robust aircraft, but it was being pushed to its limits, as were its pilots. The constant, brutal attrition meant every machine was precious, every repair hurried. He ignored it. There was no time for diagnostics. The bombers filled his sights, growing larger, more detailed. He could almost make out the faces of the gunners in their plexiglass domes. These were men who had flown from distant airfields in England, endured the cold, the fear, and the relentless attacks. They were as determined as he was. A series of sharp cracks echoed through his airframe. Not hits, but close. Very close. The B-17's tail gunner, sitting in his isolated turret, was already sending a stream of lead his way. The tracers were faster now, like angry red wasps. He tightened his grip on the stick, his knuckles white. He fired. A sustained, brutal burst. The FW-190 bucked and roared. The 20mm shells hammered into the wing of the lead B-17. Not the fuselage, not the engines, the wing. A visible shower of debris erupted from the bomber's surface, glittering momentarily in the sun, before being torn away by the slipstream. He held the trigger, pouring more fire into the wounded target. The FW-190 was a devastating weapon at close range. Then, a sudden, sickening lurch. Not a hit from the bomber, but from somewhere else. A sharp, violent jolt that threw him against his harness, the cockpit filled with a searing, acrid smell, cordite and ozone. His instrument panel flickered, then died. The engine coughed, a terrible, grinding sound. Then fell silent. Utter silence, save for the rush of wind. He was hit. He fought the stick, trying to control the sudden, catastrophic loss of power. The FW-190, once an extension of his will, was now a dead weight, plummeting out of the formation. A glance over his shoulder. A P-51, its nose gun spitting, flashed past him, a blur of olive drab and white stripes. The Mustang pilot had been waiting, a silent hunter. The ground was rushing up, still obscured by the broken cloud layer. He was falling, a steel coffin, towards the patchwork fields he had vowed to defend. The thin line had broken. Not the bomber formation, but his own. He wrestled with the canopy latch, the emergency release. The thought was stark, unyielding. Eject. But first, he had to get clear. The aircraft was spinning, an uncontrolled descent. The air whistled around the shattered canopy. The fight for the sky was over. The fight for his life had just begun. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was no longer a hunter, but the hunted, and the descent was swift and unforgiving. The world blurred into a maelstrom of greys and whites. Klaus Richter fought the unresponsive stick, the FW-190 tumbling, a twisted metal bird without wings. The scream of the wind was deafening, the cabin a whirlwind of detached instruments and shredded plexiglass. His training, drilled into him through countless hours, took over. Altitude, rapidly decreasing. Speed, too high for bailing out safely. He had to regain some control, however fleeting. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, he forced the stick hard right, kicking rudder. The spin tightened, then slowly, agonizingly, began to flatten into a dive. The horizon, a chaotic blur moments before, steadied, albeit at a terrifying angle. He was hurtling towards the clouds. He pulled the canopy release lever again, harder this time. With a shriek of tortured metal, the canopy ripped away, swallowed by the slipstream. A blast of freezing air slammed into him, stinging his face, tearing at his oxygen mask. He fumbled for the parachute D-ring. His left arm was numb, a dead weight, blood soaking through the sleeve of his flight suit. A shard of shrapnel, a brutal memento from the P-51's burst, had found its mark. The clouds consumed him. He plunged into a grey, suffocating world of vapour, losing all sense of direction. He needed to get out. Now! He unstrapped his harness, his right hand working feverishly, clumsily against the resistance of the G-forces. One final, desperate shove against the control panel, and he was clear, ripped from the cockpit, flung into the maelstrom. A silent count. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. He pulled the D-ring. The jolt was violent, almost tearing him apart. The canopy snapped open with a thunderclap, blossoming above him a white silken flower in a grey world. He swung wildly, suspended between a falling aircraft and the earth, the silence unnerving after the roar of battle. Below, the ragged holes in the clouds revealed a patchwork of fields. And smoke. Columns of dark, greasy smoke rising into the sky from the distant horizon. Not from the industrial heartland he had tried to defend, but closer. Too close. He watched, helpless as the smoke plumes multiplied, grim markers of the battle's progress. The bombers had passed, their mission accomplished. Hours later, shivering, his injured arm throbbing, Klaus was picked up by a local search party. The field where he landed was muddy, churned by heavy boots. He was helped into a staff car, its heater struggling against the winter chill. The driver, a young soldat, looked at him with a mix of awe and pity. Back at his squadron's dispersed airfield, the atmosphere was a mix of grim resignation and muted relief. Only 2 FW-190s from his 6-man patrol had returned. 2. He was the third, retrieved from a field, a casualty, saved from a fatal crash. 3 pilots, 3 machines gone. In total, the day's losses for JG-26 were devastating. 17 fighters lost, over a dozen pilots killed or wounded. The intelligence officer, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually slumped posture, chalked up the numbers on a board. Initial reports suggest at least 300 B-17s and B-24s hit targets in the Ruhr. Our flak accounted for 12. Our fighters... He paused, a heavy sigh escaping his lips, claimed 26 confirmed kills, 4 probables. Klaus listened, his mind detached. 12 from the formidable flak batteries, 26 from hundreds of intercepting fighters. Against 700 bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, the mathematics was stark. 40 aircraft lost out of 700 was a cost the Americans could easily absorb. 70% of their own fighter force, however, was a wound the Luftwaffe could not. The replacement aircraft would come, perhaps. Pilots would arrive from hurried, abbreviated training courses, less experienced, less prepared. It was a vicious cycle. They were throwing their best into the meat grinder, and the enemy simply produced more. More steel, more machines, more pilots. The industrial might of America, which Admiral Yamamoto had once warned about, was now a daily, crushing reality for the defenders of the Reich. He walked to the squadron's operations room, the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke thick in the air. A map on the wall, marked with pins and coloured string, showed the day's events. The bomber stream, a thick red line, had passed deep into Germany. The thin blue lines of the intercepting squadrons were broken, scattered. The invisible wall, the one they tried to be, was simply overwhelmed. He looked at the empty hooks on the readiness board, knowing that tomorrow the numbers would only get worse. The silence of the base was not peace, it was merely the calm before the next storm. The weight of the world, it seemed, was measured in tons of bombs, not acts of courage. Weeks blurred into a relentless cycle of patrols, scrambles, and the chilling mathematics of attrition. Klaus Richter's arm had healed, but the scars were internal, etched deeper with each passing day. The optimism, the youthful ardor of the early war had been replaced by a grim, professional fatalism. The skies over Germany were no longer a battleground of equals. They were a conveyor belt of destruction, relentlessly moving towards an inevitable conclusion. The Jägerleitung's voice, once a precise guide, now often conveyed a tone of weary resignation. Angel of the North, contact confirmed. Strength estimates increasing. The estimates always increased. The numbers were irrefutable. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force alone could dispatch over 700 heavy bombers on a single mission. By the summer, this figure would regularly exceed 1,000. Each bomber carrying a payload of up to 8,000 pounds of high explosive. Each mission a deliberate, pulverizing strike against the very sinews of the German war machine. Fuel was becoming a critical issue. The synthetic fuel plants, once churning out enough for the entire Luftwaffe, were priority targets. Raids like the one Klaus had intercepted in January were specifically designed to cripple this vital resource. Now, every flight was carefully rationed. Training missions, once extensive, were almost non-existent. New pilots arrived with barely 50 hours in the cockpit, thrown into combat against veterans with hundreds of kills. It was like sending boys to fight giants. Richter remembered a new arrival, barely out of flight school, asking, "Oberleutnant, how do we stop them?" Klaus had looked at him, seeing a flicker of his own past hope, now extinguished. "You fight," he had replied, "until you can't." It was not an answer. It was a testament to their desperate terminal situation. The quality of the aircraft, too, was suffering. Spare parts were scarce. Maintenance was a hurried affair. His FW-190, once a precision instrument, felt heavier, slower, less responsive. The roar of its engine, once reassuring, now seemed to carry a note of strain. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, the backbone of the fighter force, was outclassed by the newer American designs, the P-51 Mustangs, now ubiquitous, effortlessly outclimbed, outsped, and outranged them. Germany was fighting a modern war with increasingly obsolete tools. One crisp spring morning, the Jägerleitung came through with a new, chilling update. Angel of the North, multiple contacts forming, estimating over 1,000 bombers, heading Berlin. 1,000. The sheer scale was beyond comprehension. The entire fighter force of the Reich, scattered across dozens of airfields, barely amounted to that many operational machines, and many would be grounded for lack of fuel or parts. Klaus climbed into his cockpit, the metal cold beneath his gloved hands. He watched his dwindling squadron take off, a few brave machines struggling to gain altitude, specks against an unforgiving sky. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the eastern horizon in hues of rose and gold. But for them, the light was fading. The air battle that day was less a fight, more a slaughter. The American formations, impregnable and disciplined, unleashed their payloads over the capital. Smoke, black and thick, rose from the heart of the city, a funeral pyre for the Reich. Klaus, caught in a desperate skirmish with 4 P-51s, saw a B-17 disintegrate mid-air, not from his fire, but from an unknown cause, perhaps a direct hit from another fighter, or a mechanical failure. It was a single bomber, a tiny fragment, lost in a colossal formation that barely noticed its absence. He returned to base, his aircraft riddled with bullet holes, his ammunition depleted. The silence of the airfield was profound, heavy with unspoken losses. No victory claims were made. There was no exhilaration, no sense of accomplishment. Only the cold, hard fact that the tide had not turned. It had merely continued its relentless advance. The war had moved beyond the tactical brilliance of individual pilots or the inherent quality of their machines. It had become a war of industrial output, of raw materials, of sheer, overwhelming numbers. Germany, like Japan, had entered the conflict, believing in the superiority of its warriors and its initial technological edge. But faced with an enemy that could simply build more, faster, and with endless resources, that advantage had evaporated. Klaus looked up at the darkening sky, no longer seeing an arena of combat, but a canvas for a far larger, more brutal truth. The light was indeed fading, not just the sun setting on another day, but the light of hope for victory, extinguished by the relentless, crushing weight of an industrial disparity that could not be overcome. The war for them was no longer a matter of fighting for a cause. It was simply a matter of enduring the inevitable. The night was coming, and with it, the cold certainty of defeat.